Hey students, how are we doing today? This is part 3 of the American Identity series that I'm putting together to prepare for the AP exam. We've already talked about the immigrants. We've talked about Native Americans, and today what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about African Americans. And just like before, I've divided this up into time periods, and what we're going to do is we're going to go through it, and I'm going to cover the big points that I think you should know going into the AP exam. Try to make yourself comfortable with these topics. If some of them don't sound familiar, what you might want to do is go ahead and look them up and maybe use those to study, and use this as your study guide for what I know and what I don't know about African Americans in U.S. history. So we're going to get right started on the year 1619. That's going to be when African Americans are first brought into the colonies. They're brought to Jamestown by the Dutch. The Dutch came in, brought 40 Africans, brought them in as indentured servants. But that's not going to last, we know that, and eventually they'll transfer over to that permanent slave system. Now this is going to be spurred on by the growth of tobacco and the growth of the plantation system in the southern colonies. So we're going to move from there. As we move beyond 1619 all the way through the 1600s, it's just going to be more Africans coming in through the triangle trade process. And we'll talk about, the Middle Passage and everything they went through there. But it all starts in 1619 when the Dutch brought the first ship over. When we get to 1640 to 1676, what we're going to see, honestly, is we're going to see some of the first slave codes come together. 1640, I believe, is the first slave code, what you can and can't do with your slave at this time. 1676, we basically, by that time, have slavery throughout the colonies. Not just in the southern colonies, but in New England colonies and middle colonies as well. Obviously, tobacco is going to pull most of the slaves to the south. Cotton's going to come in, but the cotton's not going to be a major crop in the South until the 1700s, really 1793 with the introduction of the cotton gin. 1676 is also a big year. That's going to be Bacon's Rebellion. I've mentioned this in several studies. Make sure you know Bacon's Rebellion. Study that, understand why it happened, and the outcome of that as well. The next time period I want to talk about is 1676 to 1776. We're going to see the growth of slavery during this time. It's really going to start to take off. The numbers of slaves coming in is going to grow. We're going to start using the Caribbean kind of as a filter. A lot of the slaves were brought to the Caribbean first before they came to North America and came to the southern colonies. Another big year, 1770, the Boston Massacre. The first person killed in the Boston Massacre, Crispus Attucks, a freed man, a freed slave in Boston, so you need to know that name. Not a lot's going to change. Really, we're not seeing a whole lot going on, but we get into 1776, the beginning of the American Revolution, and actually what we see is slaves fighting on both sides of this war. There was a method that the British would use, that if you escaped and would fight alongside them, they would give you your freedom once the war was over. We saw this happen in the War of 1812 as well, so this is not going to be uncommon. Also during this time, the Articles of Confederation are created, and part of the Articles of Confederation will be the Northwest Ordinance. Now the Northwest Ordinance is basically going to come out in 1787, and you kind of got to look at what the founders did here, because you can see evidence with the Northwest Ordinance Treaty or Territory Ordinance in 1787 that they tried to do the right thing, because what they did is they banned slavery in the Northwest Territory. And so this is our first real laws towards the end of slavery, I guess, if you will. 1788 to 1808. This is when the United States has just adopted the new U.S. Constitution. Several key compromises during this time. The Three-Fifths Compromise, which we all know and we're familiar with. The other compromise is the International Slave Trade Compromise, where we agree that we will only participate in the international slave trade for another 20 years, bringing it to an end in 1808. By the end of this time period, 1808, we have enough slaves within our country to self-sustain the system at this point. So the international slave trade is not really necessary as far as we're concerned. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. You're starting to see slavery start to kind of be pulled back from the northern colonies during this time period and being more focused down in the southern colonies. I believe it was, don't quote me on this, Vermont was the first state to actually ban slavery. When we get to 1793, this is a big year for slaves. This is the invention of the cotton gin, and obviously that's going to change the structure down in the South because everyone is making a lot of money producing cotton. Now that we have the cotton gin, that takes away it takes away the labor-intensive process of cleaning the cotton. So now we can, grow a lot more cotton, produce a lot more cotton, and that's going to require more slaves in the fields to get this done. Also in 1793 is the very first fugitive slave law. Now this slave law is going to be in place throughout the history leading up to the end of the Civil War. It's just going to be altered a bit as time goes on, especially when we get to the Compromise of 1850. I believe I forgot something somewhere. I just want to check my notes here. We'll just keep pressing on. 1800 to 1820. The big event here is the Louisiana Purchase, and the United States is going to be spreading west. The further west we spread, especially in the South, the more agricultural land we need, the more plantations that are going to be growing up, the more slaves we're going to need. We're going to see several rebellions during this time. Gabriel's Rebellion is probably the biggest rebellion. It's actually one of the biggest rebellions in our history. And 1820 marks the Missouri Compromise. This is when the slave debate actually hits Congress hard for the first time. And what we see is Missouri is going to come in as a slave state and be mirrored by the fact that Maine is going to come in as a free state. And what we're going to see within the Senate of the U.S. Congress is they're going to try to maintain a balance between slave states and free states during this time. Going into 1820 to 1820 to 1845? Maybe I did. I skipped a year again. 1820 to 1845, we're going to see the gag rule put in place. 1836 in Congress, where they don't want to talk about slavery anymore, so they put a gag rule on it. That doesn't really have a lot of an effect. 1831, write this down, the Nat Turner Rebellion, another big slave rebellion during this time. And also Texas is going to enter the Union as a state in 1848, coming in as another slave state, which is going to raise a lot more questions about the entry of new states coming into our country. That will take us to 1845 to 1863, a major time period as far as African Americans go and the slave trade. 1848, we're going to see the Mexican-American War. As a result of that, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and with that we have a lot more new land. What do we do with it? Is slavery going to be allowed? And the question becomes, do we stick to the Compromise of 1820, which set the 3630 line, saying every state that enters north of that line will become a free state, every state below that line is a slave state? Well, Texas has already kind of thrown that, that out with the bathwater, just because Texas, the line goes right through Texas, and Texas, the whole state, is a slave state. So what this is going to lead to is the Compromise of 1850. And this is one thing you guys really need to know. There was 5 key points to the Compromise of 1850. You need to know at least 2 or 3 of these points. Number 1, California is going to come in as a free state. 2, the original line or the original boundaries of Texas are going to be changed. Texas is going to cede land to the federal government in order to get its debt paid off. If you look at old maps of Texas, it's kind of like the big antenna coming off, and that antenna actually reaches as far north as Wyoming. What else? We got California, Texas, Washington, D.C. They end the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Now be careful. Don't talk about Washington, D.C. ending slavery, because they didn't. All they did was they outlawed the slave trade within Washington, D.C. And then the big one that I want to talk about is the Fugitive Slave Act. What they did, that same law going back to 1793, the Fugitive Slave Law, they're going to strengthen the Fugitive Slave Law, and what's going to happen is now the citizens of the North are responsible to help return slaves to the South, the escaped slaves. So what I taught you in class and what I've said over and over again is what this does is it gets the northern citizens involved in the slavery debate. Up until this point, they really weren't. Yes, you had the abolition movement during the 1830s. We talked about the rise of William Lloyd Garrison and the abolitionists. I didn't mention it, but yes, that was going on. But this was not a major portion of society. Honestly, the North was economically dependent on the slavery of the South, so it was kind of like that, you know that that cousin you don't want to talk about, the one that makes your family look bad, but you just kind of ignore him like he doesn't exist. It's time the cousin shows up to the family reunion, and we got to face what's in our family. And that's what strengthening the fugitive slave law is going to do. That's going to take us into the 1850s. And the 1850s, we see step by step by step, we're going right to the Civil War. Starts with 1852. We start the Compromise of 1850. 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin is published, which basically puts a human element or a human viewpoint on the condition of slavery. 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. What the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is it allows popular sovereignty in the Kansas-Nebraska territory to determine whether or not they're going to have slavery. That completely nullifies the Missouri Compromise, so it's thrown out the window. That's going to lead to Bleeding Kansas in 1856, and John Brown and his sons go into Kansas, and we have a lot of, it's like a mini Civil War. It's like a precursor or like a preview to the Civil War. The Potawatomi Massacre happens during this time. 1957, the Dred Scott ruling, which basically says that African Americans, the slaves, they're not citizens. They're not even close to being citizens. They are property. And Roger Taney, the Chief Justice, says that. So that's a big thing. 1859 is Harper's Ferry. And interestingly, the first person killed at Harper's Ferry is a freed black man. This is led by John Brown. And finally, this is going to take us into 1860 and the election of Abraham Lincoln on the Free Soil platform. Now remember, Abraham Lincoln, he wasn't coming into office to bring an end to slavery. He was coming into office to stop the spread of slavery. And I think that's what makes him such a great president, is the fact that he changes his viewpoint within his term of office. That he doesn't just stick to, this is what I ran on, and I don't have, and I'm not going to change that. He sees what slavery is doing, and he does change his mind later into the Civil War. The Civil War starts in 1861, and the next big event for African Americans is the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Now, this was Lincoln's attempt to give a moral cause to the fighting for the Civil War. Remember, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free a single slave. It was drafted to say that all the slaves of the separated states, the states that had seceded, those slaves were now free. But the Confederate government doesn't follow what Lincoln's saying, so the Emancipation Proclamation really has no value in the South. Its value stands behind the reasoning of it, and it gives those fighting in the Civil War a moral cause to fight. And one more thing, just like I said, it didn't free any slaves. The border states during the Civil War, those who chose to remain with the Union, they were allowed to keep their slaves. Lincoln couldn't risk them seceding as well and joining the Confederacy. So while the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves of the 11 seceded states, it did nothing to those slaves who lived and worked in the border states. That's going to take us post-Civil War, 1865, 1867, 1870. And what we have here is the Reconstruction Amendments. You have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment set the slaves free. The 14th Amendment granted them citizenship. And the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote. Basically, one thing I want to point out that we tend to overlook, and I see this on our tests and everything like that, women were not happy about the 15th Amendment and the African American males getting the right to vote. They had been protesting for this since the 1830s, and they feel like they're just kind of being shunned by this point. And I think it was Frederick Douglass who actually made the statement to the women, not to be mad because this is not your time. This is our time. And that's what it was. The African American males get the right to vote in 1870. Going beyond that, let's talk 1865 to 1877. Again, another slide I forgot to put in. I do apologize for that. But basically, when we talk about this time period, the period of Reconstruction, um, the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be created under Congressional Reconstruction. Sharecropping and the cropland system start to creep into Southern society. And then President Grant, honestly, should be considered a friend to the African American, because he is going to go and impose those military districts. He's going to send the Freedmen's Bureau down there. He's going to pass the force bill to bring the end to the KKK, which was rising up in the South at this point. So he did a lot to try to help the African American in the South. But he didn't do enough. We see during this time period, as we get into 1877, at the end of Reconstruction, when Rutherford B. Hayes comes in and beyond, going into the Gilded Age, we're going to see the rise of Jim Crow laws. We're going to see black codes. I mean, they've already been in place, but black codes. We're going to see almost a system of another system of indentured servitude down in the South. It's not quite the same, because it's a perpetual invent. It's almost like another slavery, but it's slavery by another name. It's more of an economic slavery at this time. You do see some African Americans in the North starting to get jobs in factories at this point, but not as many as you would think, because the unions are starting to grow. As we saw during the Gilded Age, as the unions grow, they limit African American membership into their unions, and without membership in the unions, you cannot get jobs in the factories. Big date during this time, 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. This is the second Supreme Court case dealing with African Americans, and the Plessy versus Ferguson case we talked about is what establishes the separate but equal policy for the United States. We can separate our society by race as long as everyone has equal opportunity. And, on paper sounded great. Reality, we know that just wasn't the case at all. This could take us to the 1900s to the 1920s. And we see three guys rising up during this time, or two guys rising up during this time: Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington, his idea was to give the African Americans a skill. And if you teach them a skill, that's going to help them become more ingrained in society and more accepted in society. W.E.B. Du Bois basically said, no, we need to give them an education. He is one of the founders of the NAACP. He says we need to send them to college, because it's going to be the education that's going to help them be part of society. These two guys were, they're fighting for the same thing. They're fighting for the African Americans to be part of society, to not be on the outskirts of society looking in. They want to bring them in. But they had two completely different methods to actually do that. I think it was during this time that we see Marcus Garvey rise up and a new American colonization society form up. We're trying to get African Americans to go back to Africa. We saw this during the reform movements of the 1830s and 1840s. The idea that give the slaves their freedom and then go back to Africa and start over. I think it was Alexis de Tocqueville who said that the only way that our society would survive would be, with regards to the races, is if we absolutely segregated each other from one another, because there's not going to be complete acceptance. And the American Colonization Society, and then later Marcus Garvey during the 1910s and 1920s, that's what they're going to try to do. During World War I, 1914 to 1918, that's when we see the great migration of African Americans to the north to get jobs in the factory. Also during the 1920s, you need to be aware of the Harlem Renaissance. Noah Langston Hughes, the poet laureate of Harlem during that time. This is, you see the rise of jazz. I'm drawing an absolute blank on the jazz singers, Louis Armstrong and all of those. That's all coming out of the Harlem Renaissance. So that's going to take us into the 1920s. The next time period I want to talk with regards to, African Americans were hit during the 1930s just like everybody else with the Great Depression. The 1940s, what we're going to see is World War II, and we're going to see African Americans fighting in segregated unions. Probably one of the most famous units will be the Tuskegee Airmen during this time. What this is going to lead to, though, is a more acceptance into into society. FDR, during his term, he signed an executive order that was going to integrate defense contractors. So if you were a defense contractor working for the government, you had to have an integrated workforce. Harry Truman, later in the 1940s, is going to integrate the military. It's not going to happen during World War II, but after World War II, he will integrate the military, and this is actually going to start the civil rights movement. 1947, Jackie Robinson. You can't talk about the civil rights movement without hitting on Jackie Robinson and him breaking the color barrier, going into Major League Baseball, signing a contract with the Brooklyn Dodgers. So all of that goes on in the 1940s, which is going to lead us to the 1950s, which is a huge, huge year for African Americans. It's interesting, 1850s was big as far as slavery and the fight for slavery in our country. And 100 years later, we see we're finally getting to the civil rights movement where it really starts to take off. And it starts with Brown v. Board of Education, 1954, which is going to desegregate our schools. And we're going to see that, and that'll lead to events like the Little Rock Nine, the standoff with George Wallace, Governor Wallace, at the University of Alabama. We talked about that. 1955, Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus, which is going to lead to the Montgomery bus boycott, which is going to go on for 11 months. I mentioned the Little Rock Nine. That's in 1957. That's going to take us into the 1960s. 1960s is when we're going to see a lot of the sit-ins, especially at the lunch counters. Greensboro, North Carolina, where you see the Greensboro Four and their refusal to get up, and that's going to start a movement of sit-ins. You're going to see the rise of Martin Luther King. I mean, he's the one who organized the Montgomery bus boycott. But during the 1960s, we're going to see Martin Luther King take a more not a more active role, because he was very active the entire time. But what we're going to see is he's going to start pushing the president, John F. Kennedy Jr. He's going to start pushing him to get that Civil Rights Act passed. It's not going to happen, but by Kennedy. But Johnson will actually sign the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act into law in 1964 and 1965. Also in 1963 is when Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. If you have time, you need to listen to that speech. Every American needs to listen to that speech. I'll just say that right now. 1964, like I said, Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act. He also signs the 24th Amendment. The 24th Amendment outlaws poll taxes, and that's something that's going on, especially down in the South, to keep African Americans from voting. 1965 is the Voting Rights Act, and then 1968 is going to be the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and that's kind of used as the bookend to bring the civil rights movement to an end. When we get into the 1970s to the present time, you can talk about 1970s, the backing case, the affirmative action case. You can talk about the different cases that's going to deal with affirmative action in the 1990s. And quite honestly, you can end your discussion in 2008 with the election of Barack Obama as president, the first African-American president, who's going to break that ceiling, the ceiling of African Americans in politics. So there you have it. It's a quick, what do we got, a 23-minute review of African Americans in history, but hopefully it'll give you a good place to start. Again, if some of this stuff didn't sound familiar, use this to start your studying. Start looking this stuff up and use this as a guide. So that's going to be part 3, African Americans. I have one more part that's going to be women in America, and that will be coming up next. You can also check out my review for immigrants and Native Americans as well. Hope you guys have a great day, and we'll see you on the next video.